Yeah. Like, major. And I'm fucking stoked to be doing it. So, yeah, that's right. We have to, I gotta pull all these, I gotta pull this stool out of here. Okay, so we gotta go in the bathroom, finish up the lower end, sanding, and then I can move on into the bedroom. Once I'm done with that, I'm just gonna call it a night. I'm freaking beat. It's Friday. Always beat up on Friday. Spent all week beating myself up. Guys, I'm so beat. I am so fucking sore. Can't even explain it. I'm just tight and swollen up and just sore. I never stop. It's just so irritating. Can't stop. If I stop, I won't get it done. And my kids don't even have. It's just a lot. There's a lot on my plate. Okay, it'll be all right. We're gonna work through it. So this is what I've been sanding in here. It's really a mess, to be honest. See, there's stuff like this just everywhere. Big old chunks, and it's like, come on, you know? You never get, oh my God. They didn't get any of the dust. So like when you paint and you get dust and chunks in your paint, you know, I get a filter and it's called a screen, a paint screen. And you just screen it out and it gets all this stuff out of here. Also, if you're kicking around dust and you get all this junk from the floor on your roller or it kicks up in the air and it gets in your paint, you're gonna leave a bunch of this stuff, okay? Typically, paint from Home Depot will chunk up like this because it dries up and then gets, I don't know, it's just junk paint. And typically that will happen with junk paint. It dries up really quick in the pan. And then when you roll it, you get all that dried up paint in the new paint, as you know, so you always want to cover your paint so that it doesn't dry up and then have that hard paint get back in the wet paint, because it's everywhere. It's all over the walls. It's all over the doors. And then the drips are everywhere. That's another sign that they used lower end paint. Lower end paint is more watery. It's less binding polymers, less, what do they call it? Drying polymers as well. so it doesn't dry as fast, it doesn't bind as well, and it's just more liquid. You're literally buying more water with plastic water, really. It doesn't have all the other good properties in it that makes it a really good effective paint. You got hide, you got thickness, you got binding, and you got drying polymers. So all those things included, you got a really good paint. And you got stuff you can put flow in it that'll literally keep it wet. It'll stop the air from attacking the paint, and it'll keep the paint wetter and more fluid on the brush, and it'll flow better. It applies a lot wetter. It's called Flow, and it's actually a really cool product. Great for when you're painting a door on a really hot day. It keeps that paint wet so you can set the strokes correctly. Anyway, I'm gonna get this in. Let's get it. If you zoom into this, you can see there has been so many holes screwed into the wall and pulled out. It looks like little mountains. And it's just, I just can't paint over that until it's flat. And I'll even come through and seal it with seal the holes with sealant. And then you just, to me, it's worth it for me. That way, if it's going to be a plywood wall, okay. It'll be a plywood wall without paint drips, holes everywhere, big, huge mountains of boogers and whatever. switch from this 60 grit down to 100 grit. To do the door, because the door is a lot thinner. I mean, look, there's fuming hair. They literally left their hair. 1, 2, 3 hairs, 4 hairs. I mean, it could be a paintbrush hair, but still, like, big drip, booger, 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 booger. There's friggin' boogers everywhere. Drip, drip, drip. Even if I was like beginner, oh my god, the doorknob's 2 different colors, for crying out loud. I have brand new nice doorknobs, alright? Anyway, let's just move on before I have a heart attack. Makes me wonder if like the person who painted this really doesn't care, or if they do care but they just didn't know, you know. Obviously it doesn't matter anymore, but where I'm going back over everyone else's work, I'm just curious, that's all. It's just curiosity, to be honest. 5 hairs. Right there. 6 hairs. That's just right there. That's another thing. Cheap brush, cheap equipment. You know, you can paint something and get the paint on, and it still will look like shit. You know what I mean? Sometimes you got to just spend a little extra money and get the better stuff. You won't have all these extra problems. Show you. See these big, oh my gosh, I'm sorry. Okay, look. All right, see these big, long, streaking drips? Like they're very noticeable, right? Huge drips. There's some more right there. So that's either a scar from a roller or it's a scar from a brush, maybe. No, that looks like a holiday because it ran this way. So it got wet in this corner. No, that's a scar from running. So it's a scar that dripped as well. But I mean, you see, those things matter. Yes, I know it's a plywood wall. I can't do anything about that right now. I don't have them. I just built a 2-bedroom apartment over there out of scratch. I know it's crazy. It's killing me almost. I'm like just thinking. I know I need a haircut. I get it, but I would like to show you guys the difference. This was done with a cheap brush or roller, the cheapest paint they could find, and the most inexperienced painter. And I can just tell that by the boogers that they left, the hairs from the paintbrush that they left, the holiday scar marks that they left. And I can tell that the paint was cheap just by the way that it fell off the door before it had a chance to dry. So that's nothing to say that they're bad people. I'm just saying that I can teach you guys how to do much better paint jobs. And if you hang out with me and you can get down with me and ride with me and just take the long course, I will show you how to be a professional painter. Not just an okay painter, oh, I know a little bit of, no. I am a high-end, exquisite interior painter, like high-end. I can't really give you high-end in this house. I tried with the specialty AZEK, molding, I tried to dress it up, all this extra trim I did. I tried to dress it up. I got all beautiful shelves I'm going to put in after I paint. You can put lipstick on the pig, but it still has plywood walls. Whatever. I will still have a good paint job in this house. I'm not going to drop my quality and just paint over, holidays and drips and boogers and hairs and mountains of plywood that pulled out with the screw and loose plywood leaflets that are popping off. Like, I'm not going to do that. It's just not my style. I wouldn't even want to do the job if I had to do that. I would literally leave it until I could do it this way. I have the time now, so we're just going to do it the right way. And we'll leave it 100%. We'll give it 100% of what I got. Okay? Oh, and by the way, we are going to be using emerald on all of the ceilings and walls. It just so happened to be that that's what I have left, and I got a lot of it, and that's what it's getting. So I saved the emerald for the exterior paint and stuff, and I'll still have that left over. But most of the paint that I'm going to be mixing together is going to be literally the best emerald that you can buy. Okay? So we are going to have high-end paint in this house. High-end paint in this unit that I'll be spraying in just probably tomorrow. If I don't get the first coat on tomorrow, it'll definitely get 2 coats on Sunday. Either way, it's getting 2 coats on Sunday. pull out of here. Yep, we got this one bedroom to do, and I'm sore as hell. I'm just gonna go eat some dinner and go to hell to bed, to be honest, after this. Got this one bedroom. I've already caulked this bedroom, so there shouldn't be any gaps or cracks in this bedroom at all, but to be determined. Hi. Yeah. I want to put lights in all of my closets. I think that would be a nice touch. But in this house, well, at least in this apartment, it's kind of almost not even worth it. Because this apartment really, it needs a lot more than that. Every ceiling and every wall is plywood in here. But I'm just gonna get it done. Here we go. As soon as I sand this, I'm done for the night. I'm beat, I need some sleep, I need rest. I need to eat a lot of good healthy food and rest. And drink a lot of water. Oh, speaking of that, my muscles are already dry. Water. Ooh. Man, that made my head feel better. So tomorrow, I don't know if it's going to be too much more fun, but yeah, also taking out tacks out of the wall. But yeah, so tomorrow we're going to be cleaning this place up really well. I'll be done with carpentry. I got to pull the doorknobs, just stuff like that. But today and tomorrow morning, I'll be wrapping up anything that needs to be unscrewed and needs to, everything that needs to be covered over, masked over with tape and plastic. And then I'll clean the place really well. Then I'm just gonna lay drop cloths. I'll tape the border. I'll lay drop cloths and I'll tape the border off everywhere. And then I'll paint. To me, it's like, why not just tape? Because if I tape, then I know for a fact that there is nothing getting anywhere. And for me, it's a lot easier than going around cleaning up paint off of a floor. Here, I want to show you this. Look, right at eye level, paint drip, right chest level. I don't get it. Why leave that? Why leave the drip? Why leave it? I don't understand. Just wipe it off while it's wet. take a brush and wipe it. But in this stuff, look at this. Boogers. Big, clunky boogers everywhere. And they're not even just from screw holes. They're actually, it's everywhere. So it really is. It's from when they rolled, they left their paint out. They didn't put a cover or bag over it. It dried up, right? And all them little paint, the skin of the paint got dry. Then when they rolled the new paint into it, it peeled some of that dried up paint and it turned to boogers, and then it stuck to the wall and they didn't pick it off. They didn't, see? So that's why it's super important to cover over your roller. I like to put a roller cover or a bag over my roller and put a trash bag over my roller tray. If I have to take a break, go online, stop for a cigarette, whatever it is. Sometimes if it's windy or super dry, I'll even keep the cover, I'll keep the bag over it, and every time I'll hold that bag up and then I'll put, so I keep it in the bag the whole time, just to make sure that I don't get any boogers. Especially on a high-end job, you gotta be careful that dust and debris doesn't get kicked into it or fall into it. So, anyway, there's just quite a bit. There's quite a bit to the paint world that you don't understand. Some people maybe don't give a crap. Whatever. But if you want to learn, like up here, if you can zoom in, this was like a screw hole that they put glue on. And there's 1, 2, 1, 2. So they glued some sort of curtain rod or something, and they left the glue up here and then painted over it. And if you're curious, I'm using 100 grit Festool sandpaper with a Festool sander and vacuum. The vacuum really does stop a lot of the dust, and the dust is super important to collect as fast as possible, because you don't want all that dust on the air, on the ground, because I'm going to be spraying, even if you're rolling. Because any bit of dust, just think of paint like a magnet, okay? The moisture from the paint literally sucks dust out of the air and clings it to itself. So it's literally a magnet for dust. Anything that's up in the air, boom, right to the wall before it dries. And then next thing you know, you've got dust all over your wall, and it feels like sandpaper. You want your walls to feel a baby smooth. I know I'm not going to get that with this plywood, but I don't want big chunks the size of a quarter hanging off my wall like this. So I'm going to sand. I'm 3/4 of the way done, probably 80% done, 90, this is the last bedroom. So at the very least 2/3, but those other rooms were huge. So I'm really like 85% done. I'm going to sand this real quick, and I'm going to hell to bed. Even the stuff that I would leave like on the trim, I can't get it all, but I'm gonna get 90–95% of it. Biggest thing is we don't want gunk, we don't want to heat up the paint and turn it into a hard, gooey substance. We want to sand, just straight up sand it like it would on, great paint dust in a way. If it starts to gunk up on you, that means your paper is getting too hot and the abrasiveness is worn out and it's just starting to muck up. something else. So over here, all right, right here, you can see where this is. You see how it's pin dotted? It's like, looks like a fish scale almost, like the from a fish almost. See how it's got so many different little slots in it? That's from the mill. This was actually almost a bark edge right here, and I had to sand it down. Well, it's over here as well. Basically, it was junk trim, and we had to use it. Well, I didn't, but it was used anyway because where I am, you know, in Maine, it's actually pretty far away from any big distributors. So any wood that comes up here is kind of frowned upon to bring back. So they sell out all their culls. Basically, this area gets the culls of all of Maine. And, you know, sometimes you'll have to sand down these boards because this had a little bump up. It was like an 1/8" bump that anyway, it looks normal now, but it didn't before. Just go around this room, pop out the screws everywhere real quick. What I can see of them anyway. I just don't want to run my sander into them, to be honest. My sander is very, very expensive. Festool is one of the most expensive tool companies you can buy from. I'll leave my tenant, the screws. I'll leave them all here for him. Because screws, you know, they're kind of fussy and just an irritant to have to track down half the time, so. Might as well leave what I have here. That way he doesn't have to track anything down. He'll just have like a little junk drawer of screws and nails to kind of use whenever he wants. I don't mind if he puts the screws back in the house. I really don't care. I just want my job to be flawless in a way. As flawless as I can get it. Plus, we don't want to damage my sander. We can't be running that sander any screws. That would suck. That would suck big dang. Kind of weird, but I ended up with these washer head screws, and I have this popping sheetrock. Basically, the sheetrock was put in, was too big, and yeah, I'm gonna leave that for tomorrow. I'll just sand it and because I gotta cut it. Basically, I want all of my sanding to be done today. I want to be completely prepped that way. And then tomorrow, I'll take the knobs off. You know, that's my last piece of carpentry I gotta do. I'll show you. It's a piece of plywood. It's bubbling out. It's actually way bigger than it looks there. I mean, yeah, see. But what it is the plywood is too big. And they just tried to screw it in anyway and force it in. And over time, it swelled up because of all the humidity. And it pops out heavy. And now it's basically taken on this shape. So what I'll do is I'll cut it to size. I'll try to bend it back a little bit, and then I'll walk it up and get to sit in there nice. I'll basically take it off. Take it off the wall, clean up the seams, because they've poured caulking in there to fill the gap over time, and I'll just put it back the right way. But yeah, that's the last piece of any trim or any wood that I need to fix in the whole house. I've done a lot of carpentry in here. nail. Okay. I'm gonna put some 60 grit on now. Holy fuck. Guys, this is what I'm out against right here. See this? See that? See that? This is what I'm sanding. Junk. It's just everywhere. Look at it. Big, huge craters. See? I could keep going. It's even on the ceilings. It's just between people, when they painted, they left drips. They either left drips, back screws, and didn't scrape off the extra plywood that pulled out with the screw, or like that's what happens when you back a screw out of plywood. Look, the drip right next to it conveniently. Or I'm dealing with this type of thing, where the plywood wants to flake off. That's the worst example that I've seen so far. But, you know, usually it's just one little leaflet. But look, I mean, it's all over the ceilings. This is the ceiling, guys. The paint boogers, and just, they put mud up on the ceiling. I don't know why they tried to mud the ceiling over drywall, painted drywall. Thank you, hon. Hey, I gotta get it right. We gotta get it right. It's the only way to do it, I guess. I don't know any other way. I mean, this is what I would do. You know, if a client gave me the job, this is exactly what I would do. And I always try to tell my client, I would do it just the way I would do my own home. If I have the time, I'm gonna do it the way I would want to do it, so. I just barely have enough time, you know, by the skin of my teeth, I'll have the time to get this done by the 15th. I have to get the sanding done tonight. Tomorrow, get all the doorknobs off, get all the tools out of here, get the rest of that one board screwed back on. I gotta cut that little board out. So the rest of the carpentry done, all the hardware either removed or covered, all the windows covered, anything masked off that I need to mask off. I need to get all the drop cloths down, all the tape put on the perimeters around the drop cloths. Because I just like to put a nice clean line of tape around all the trim. That way when I spray, it just goes much easier. And this is the thing, you tape once, you can spray 4 times. So you can put 4 coats on. You know what I'm saying? You go around with a roller, okay, the amount of time it would have taken me to do 1 coat, I've already got the prep done and 1 coat on. And then I can walk through the whole house and do 4 more coats in the amount of time it would take me to roll 1 more. So I'm gonna get way better of a job. It'll look better because it's being sprayed on. There's not even any roller marks or paintbrush marks. It's formal, way thicker coats too. Spraying gives you a much thicker coat. And I just, you know, it looked just like you sprayed a car. You know, it's just beautiful. So I have some smart primer, and I'm gonna come through and I'm gonna spray all the bad stuff with Smart Primer. And then I'm gonna, because the Smart Primer is the best primer I've ever used to lay on every surface, from PVC to wood to metal to fiberglass. I mean, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what you're laying it on. Smart Primer is the best primer in the world. I have 8 gallons of Smart Primer I can use. And then after that, I've got a crap load of Emerald, just a bunch of Emerald. I think I have 10 gallons, 15 gallons of Emerald. And I'm just gonna take all of my Emeralds and pour them into one big tote, mix them really good, screen them first. I'm gonna screen everything out of the gallon jug. And then once everything's screened off, I'll mix it up good and put a bag over it and put the sprayer suction tube into it and just start spraying everything. Yeah, I got a lot of paint left over from over the years that I got to get rid of. It's always been stored in good temperature and it's always been sealed up good. And it's always, been in good shape. So I got a lot of paint. I'll force fuck onto this house and we'll be buttoned up and ready for a good appraisal this spring. Hopefully I can come in and do this vinyl before the spring, before the appraisal. Doesn't really matter that I'm smoking in here right now because all of this is getting sprayed, every bit of it. And we'll clean the windows and we'll wash the floors after too. So, I mean, floors are a friggin' mess right now anyway. I got junk all over them. Yeah, this is how you break something down to build it up. It's the same way boot camp, everything. The clients and tenants, they get freaked out sometimes because you're cutting into the house, you're ripping the trim off, you're taking the sheeting off, and you're exposing walls. And they said, wait, I thought that you was gonna help this place. I thought you was gonna make this place look better. And it's like, yep, 75% of what I have to do to make your place look better is actually, to be honest, it's actually removing a lot of things and replacing a lot of things. And that takes to show your skeleton of your house and to sand things down and make it look rough. Because when you sand things down, you're making it smooth, right? You're giving that perfect surface for a nice formal layer of paint to sit on without any cracks, gaps, dents, boogers, holidays, drips. No seams, no gaps, no black spots for the little pinholes from the nails, nothing. It's just gonna be flawless. Flawless. Now, that being said, yes, I am painting plywood, but we're gonna flawlessly paint some plywood now, folks, aren't we? We are going to flawlessly paint some plywood. I got about 3/4 of the ceiling left to sand and about half of this room to sand. So I'm gonna get to it. The sun's going down. I'm getting tired, sore, and soaking wet with sweat. So let's get it done. might be a nail. Why not just bang the damn thing in? Why bend it over? That's so weird. Pull it out with a pair of vice grips. Cut it off with a grinder. Like, why leave the damn thing hanging? It's so weird. Just don't get it. They did it like fucking 20 times. smokes, Chuck. Alright. So I've got the ceiling to do now. Well, 3/4 of the ceiling. I've already done a lot of it. No, I've already done a little of it. See, when you do things goal-oriented, it basically pays off a lot better. Like, it feels better when you get the job done, you know? So, I'm basically broken right now, but because I wanted to, get this all the sanding done, I worked harder than I normally would have, which means I got more done than if I were to just do it by the hour. I created a goal-oriented end time, and it basically forces you to produce, is what it does. So it feels that much better when you get it all done. Guys, I'm smoked. Look at my shirt. I'm literally soaked. Look at my arms. I'm soaking wet. This is crazy. Like and subscribe. Marvin, how you doing, brother? Listen, I'm going to hell to bed. I appreciate everybody's support. Please hit that subscribe button, guys. It's a huge help. Hit that subscribe button.